welcome to IFAB Online.
Cave Melia Vulture, IFAB 2020 Online.
Welcome to IFAB Online.
Welcome to our session on IFAB 2020. I'm Trisha King and I'm joining the call from London. With me is Russell Ali from Cape Town in South Africa. Russell, I met in 2015 when CASE ran a conference in Cape Town. He and his then Vice-Chancellor, Max Price, were in the middle of a challenging fees must fall student riot at the time. So we were grateful that they came and joined us. Liam, I met only a few weeks ago for the first time. Liam, originally, I think, has a very rich story to tell about how he ends up now in the UK via Uganda, via Cape Town, but that's Liam's story to tell. Russell and Liam both bring with them very rich experience of fundraising in Africa, with Europe and with other parts of the world. And our focus with this session today is the connection, the philanthropic connection between Africa and Europe. We decided when we met that although Liam is technically the moderator, he had so much to offer that we have liberated from his moderator role. And we're going to run this as a three-person panel with very light touch moderation from me if we need it. But having met these two guys, I don't think we're going to need it. So we're going to start with each of us telling something of our story and the connection with Africa. So a brief introduction from each of us and to reflect on why philanthropy is really important right now in Africa. And Russell, I'm going to ask you to kick off.
Thanks very much, Trish. So I am, as has already been mentioned, I'm Russell Ali, South African, born. And I've spent most of my working life here in South Africa. I did spend some time in the UK. I spent some time studying at the University of Cambridge and lived in London in, I think, 4 years in the apartheid period, when it was very difficult for South Africans, especially those who were politically involved, to go back home. But I returned in 1990, and I've been involved in either academia or development ever since, working at universities, now at the University of Cape Town, where I head up the advancement office, and previously at the University of Witwatersrand, where I was a professor in economics and history. But I've had, in between that, I've spent a long time working for either big foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Mott Foundation, and also for development agencies, and also had a stint with the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. I always find it quite interesting, though, when people kind of ask me, you know, what about my sort of career trajectory and how it is I've straddled these different worlds. And my sort of response is I've always seen myself as wanting to have a career of careers, as it were. I've never really been satisfied to be just doing one thing. And I find academia and advancement or philanthropy, I find it a very interesting combination, and mainly because I think that philanthropy is so contested, particularly in my part of the world, because philanthropy and development aid often are conflated. People often don't distinguish between the two. And it has sometimes a reputation that's not necessarily always positive. And so I find bringing the academic lens, a more intellectual, if you will, lens to it, helps me to navigate through a lot of the contestation.
Well, there's a fascinating, rich statement to start with. I think we may well come back to that, the lens to navigate through. It's fascinating. Thank you. Liam, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha. Thanks, Russell. My journey into fundraising began, gosh, nearly 30 years ago, and I rather fell into fundraising like many individuals. It wasn't necessarily a career I was looking to pursue. This was in the very early days of fundraising in the UK. And I arrived at London School of Economics, somewhat wet behind the ears, and I guess pursued a career which was sort of bifurcated in a sense. So I started doing alumni fundraising, where I would go out and talk to individuals face to face, and explore with them their relationship with the university and whether they might wish to support it financially. So I guess I sort of went in at the deep end, and I was seeing maybe 15 to 20 people face to face every week, which was a very, I guess, rich way of learning about fundraising, to engage in sort of direct conversations with individuals at a very sort of personal level. At the same time, I also did a lot of work developing a research center on Asian politics and society. So I guess my first geographical interest in fundraising came through the sort of the Asian context. And it was only about 15 years ago that I first traveled to Africa and became involved in Africa by becoming a board member of AMREF Health Africa, which is now probably the largest homegrown health organization, certainly in East Africa, if not in sub-Saharan Africa, operating budget of about $130 million, significant sort of Pan-African approach, but predominantly focused in East and Southern Africa. My journey from the LSE took me through the Royal Shakespeare Company, where I spent 10 years on a capital campaign, and we were raising about £115 million to redevelop the estate in the home of William Shakespeare, which was a wonderfully rich and enjoyable experience. And I worked for an artist who had a different sort of perspective on what was important for an organization. So I guess I learned a great deal in that sort of environment. My time with AMREF then led me into a volunteer role where my wife and I, she's a clinical scientist, we took a year out and we went to work on a hospital, a little cottage hospital in Zanzibar. And I essentially became the fundi, the builder, and was assisting with the building of a maternity ward. And at the same time, raising money for a very sort of small scale grassroots hospital and medical organization, upon which around 120,000 people in that part of the island relied for for deliveries, for medical attention. So that was a very rich and rewarding experience. From there, I went into consulting, so I enjoyed interactions with lots of different organizations, and continued my role with AMREF, moving on to the international board, which many of you may know is based in Nairobi. So I guess I saw the workings of that health organization, both from the perspective of a northern country, which was predominantly invested in fundraising and advocacy, and then moving into the sort of the headquarters role, where we were sort of looking at program development and program support and expansion into other terrain and territory. And I guess now that's all allowed me to sort of spend the last 5 years in Uganda, where I've been developing a new College of Physicians for Eastern, Central and Southern Africa, and spent 5 years there, and then have recently joined the African Leadership Group, which is, I mean, our mission is essentially to educate and train 3 million ethical and entrepreneurial leaders that will assist with the transformation of that continent. So I think that speaks to Russell's final point about the intersection between development aid and philanthropy, and how we often do conflate those two things. So I'm looking forward to exploring that with Tricia and Russell as we move forward today.
Isn't it fascinating how there's so much crossover, that development aid and philanthropy piece for both of your experiences? But also I'm interested in Russell's point about the academic community and the advancement community connects with yours, Liam, about the artist and the development community. And I think for all of us, it's always about working with different cultures and how we make that work. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I've worked in higher education leadership for 25 years in the UK. I think probably my biggest job was Pro-Vice Master at Birkbeck, which is a college of the University of London, very special college that educates adults in the evening in a research-intensive community, so rare and constantly under threat. In that space, I brought together fundraising, alumni relations, marketing, communications, government relations, widening access, all of the ways in which an institution might connect with its communities. I then moved to Case, where I was Vice President Global Engagement, and I had staff in the offices in London, Singapore, Mexico City, Washington, DC, and we did a lot of work across Africa out of the London office. I mean, I've worked for 3 years, 3 weeks out of 4, I was somewhere on a plane, somewhere in the world, but I undoubtedly, the work that I most enjoyed, the work that I was most challenged by, the work where I learned the most was the work that we did across Africa. And I think so it's fascinating to come together with you two to sort of reflect on those opportunities. The work that I did in Africa, it was Case working with leadership and advancement professionals, and it was about how do we build capacity. In the time that I was there was increasing understanding, there was increasing commitment that African institutions, whether they were education, which was mostly my experience, but actually arts organisations, charitable organisations, many health organisations wanted to fundraise, wanted to learn how to do that effectively from an African perspective. So I think that's the piece that connects the three of us. So mine is more of a European, London-based perspective, looking into Africa and looking across the world, whereas you two have rich experience of being in the continent, living and working there, and fundraising for the organisations you were working for. So what we agreed was that we would each of us tell a story, each of us reflect on our own practice, what happened, why it happened, and the lessons that we learned. Because I think for all of us, I don't think any of us felt like we were experts, that we could tell people joining this conference about how to do it. But we could speak to how did we do it? What did we do? What did we learn? What happened? What were the outcomes? Because I think that's often the rich learning point that comes out of those stories. And I hope that this is going to be more of a conversation as we move forward. So Russell, we're going to turn to you, if you'd like to tell us your piece.
So I started at the University of Cape Town late in 2013. And I joined the University of Cape Town from the Ford Foundation, where I'd been involved in grant making. It was called the Office for Southern Africa, and our grant making covered Zimbabwe, Namibia, Mozambique, and South Africa. And a lot of my focus was on governance and civil society. One of our programs actually was on higher education. And although it was not something that I focused on, it was one of my colleagues. As program staff, we interacted very closely with each other and would look for opportunities to collaborate. And it so happened that one of the universities in the higher education portfolio was the University of Cape Town, which happened to be my alma mater, where I did my undergraduate degree. So I was kind of brought back into sort of contact, as it were, with my my old alma mater, where I graduated in the late 70s, early 80s. And so we are speaking now about the 2000s. So quite a big gap. And I remember when I went to the University of Cape Town, it's useful to understand a little bit about the sort of historical context. Is the University of Cape Town was previously was a white university. And it gradually, slowly opened up over the years until, of course, South Africa became a democratic country in 1992, that it became an open university. So when I was at the University of Cape Town, it was still a predominantly white university, but students of color were allowed in on special permits. First of all, if we obviously met the admission criteria, but also if we wanted to study academic courses which were not offered at the so-called ethnic universities, which were created for other ethnicities, part of the elaborate apartheid structure in terms of its racial policies. So I got into the University of Cape Town and under a very special dispensation. And so I had a very, my relationship with the University of Cape Town wasn't a straightforward relationship. The exposure that I that I went through at the University of Cape Town, intellectually, academically, I always appreciated that, because it really opened my eyes to understanding the world and understanding our country. But at the same time, my personal experiences of being there almost under sufferance, and always having to justify or to defend being there, meant that I never felt that this university actually was home. It was never something that I felt that I belonged to, or belonged to me. And so I sort of, over the years, I'd become quite alienated in many ways. And so I was kind of drawn back into this university through this work, this philanthropy work that I was doing with the Ford Foundation. And when grants were discussed in our grant meetings about supporting the University of Cape Town, obviously many of those memories, came to the surface. And one of the particularly important questions that we always asked was, what kind of transformation was happening at the university, given that legacy and given that history? And it was very sort of fascinating what the university was trying to do to address that historical legacy of exclusion and white privilege. But it was always contentious. So fast forward to my contract at the Ford Foundation coming to an end, and me thinking, what will I do next? I get a call from the then Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, saying that a position has opened up at the University of Cape Town to head up advancement. And we would like you to apply because we think that you have the kinds of skills and background and experience. Completely unplanned. And so I took it out. I took up the invitation. I've interviewed, and then I was offered the job. And I had to then move from Johannesburg to Cape Town, which was also a bit of a cultural transition. But when I got, and part of the reason why I sort of accepted that sort of challenge was because, as I said, I had been engaged in these discussions around philanthropy and its role in transformation. And so it seemed to me a very sort of interesting challenge to be at the University of Cape Town, to be on the other side now, where I would have to be going out to look for money for the university. So I got to the University of Cape Town, and it was quite. It was going through a rapid demographic shift, where, and of course, having been a student there, as I said, in the late 70s, early 80s, when we were a handful of students, those of us on, students of color, and we all knew each other, to a university that where white students now, although they were the majority, but they were the minority in terms of the overall demographic profile. White students only made up 33%. And the rest were either international students or students of color, whereas when I was there, 95% of the students were white. But at the same time, the university didn't seem to have changed in terms of its institutional culture. And so the story that I actually want to sort of share is that with this came to a head in 2015, actually. And people will be familiar with it. It came to a head around the issue of a statue, significantly. The Rhodes statue. And Rhodes is a very interesting history in South Africa, in the Cape, and with the University of Cape Town, because the land is actually situated on land that Rhodes left behind in his will. And so that's where the university buildings were erected, and where a statue was actually put up in acknowledgement of this gift from the Rhodes Trust. Rhodes had already died by the time the university was relocated to this new venue. And in 2015, predominantly Black African students, Black students, some white students, raised the issue of the Rhodes legacy and how the university could reconcile its commitment to transformation, at the same time have a statue having pride of place on the university. And so they began this movement, which then became encapsulated in the slogan, #RhodesMustFall, which interestingly developed into later what you referred to the #FeesMustFall movement, but it started as there. And it really presented the university with serious challenges, because this was about legacy, this was about memory, this was about alumni, this was about heritage. But at the same time, it also impacted very directly on issues of philanthropy and fundraising, because as you know, one of the things that in philanthropy that one always sort of tries to avoid is controversy. Okay, because we know it scares, it makes donors uncomfortable. And of course, we had an outcry from alumni and donors as this movement became more and more vociferous, and at some points even conflictual, and sometimes even broke out in violence. Kind of long story short, we actually removed the Rhodes statue as a result of the mobilization of students, but also as a statement or signaling that we were really seriously committed to this transformation, and we couldn't therefore in good conscience have the Rhodes statue as a centerpiece. We can have a discussion later about statues and what this means for history and changing of history. We removed it. Of course, there was an outcry from some parts of our alumni community, some of our donors. We lost some donations, we lost some alumni, but it was something that we felt we needed to do if we were going to be true to our commitment to transformation. Interestingly, now, we in 5 years since the removal of the statue, and the students who were at the center of this movement for Rhodes Must Fall, and later quite involved in the Fallist movement more generally, have come back to the university and said to us that they would like to be involved in establishing a new bursary program or scholarship program called the Rhodes Must Fall Scholarship, which would be aimed at postgraduate study, and which that they would want to see also develop global networks of collaboration with other universities that may have gone through similar challenges. As you know, what's happening in the USA with issues around Confederacy, the Confederate statues. Of course, within the UK, particularly at Oxford University, the issue of Rhodes also emerged. And the Advancement Office is quite centrally involved in this, because we've actually embraced this. We've actually seen this as a real a test case almost of how philanthropy itself can also be a mirror and reflect the challenges and some of the contradictions around transformation. And we actually going back to some of the donors and some of the alumni who initially were very hostile to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, called it as anti-academic, anti-intellectual, wanting to transform history, wanting to remove history. And we presented them with this challenge and saying, look how this movement has actually evolved, that it's now at a point where it actually wants to integrate itself into the institutional fabric, culture, and academic programs of the university through establishing a scholarship program aimed at postgraduate students. And isn't this a nice way of actually this thing having come full circle? And we want to sort of challenge you to see whether your thinking has evolved and changed, and whether you want to be part of this movement itself. So we are at this very interesting point now where we are going out on this fundraising campaign, this fundraising drive. And it's again, a way in which to understand the university, to understand transformation, to challenge philanthropy in a way that's very concrete. And in a way that actually speaks to some of the burning cultural questions that not just South Africa, but many other societies are preoccupied with.
Lovely. Thank you, Russell. What a fascinating, long story, that piece that you've just told us. And I love that phrase about how philanthropy can mirror and reflect the challenges and contradictions of transformation. I mean, that's absolutely true for the story you've just told, but I suspect that's true just about anywhere in the world, that it's not necessarily a safe business, the world that we work in. Liam, do you want to reflect on anything that Russell's just said?
Yes, if I may. Thanks, Tricia. I guess the phrase that struck home with me was part of Russell's story from his time in the foundation as a grant maker. And that was this assessment around what sort of transformation or what level of transformation is taking place within this institution. And that's what we should be encouraging as a grant maker. And I guess Russell's given us an incredibly powerful and equally complex story. And that sort of symbolic nature of the statue falling, we witnessed in Bristol as well with Colston. So I think that's becoming an image that we're wrestling with, not just in the sort of world of philanthropy, but in society at large. And I think it's an incredibly important thing for us to discuss and debate and look into at almost at a forensic level, because it does impact on what philanthropy represents to us as individuals and also to the institutions about which we care deeply. And just to reflect on Russell's comment about transformation, I think when we're in the world of philanthropy, we need to think not just about the transformation of the beneficiary organization, but how philanthropy can lead to some level of transformation in the donor, in the individual who is making that commitment. And I think Russell sort of pointed this out when he talked about this change that is taking place, or that has taken place, through the example he so brilliantly represented to us as an audience. So I think a lot to chew over there. And I think we might also come back to Russell's comment around one thing we always try and avoid is controversy. And I think that would be an interesting thing to perhaps return to a bit later on that.
I think that may be for another day, because we're quite a long way into our hour already. So Liam, do you want to tell us your story?
Sure. I mean, my story is very different, and I was struggling to decide which story to tell. But I felt that the story of my last sort of 4 or 5 years living and working across East and Southern Africa might be helpful for the audience. And I'll try and represent this with some lessons in it. And the lesson I've learned since joining the African Leadership Group was, as was brilliantly pointed out to me by Fred Swaniker, the founder, was that we should always adopt a beginner's mindset so that we're open to learning. And it made me sort of reflect on an African proverb I used to hear in Kenya and in Tanzania, which is, we should not look where we feel, but where we slip. And I might reflect on a couple of mistakes I may have made over the last few years during the course of my storytelling. But my story is really around the power of partnership, and how partnership is how I like to look at fundraising, a partnership between the donor or the foundation and the beneficiary institution. And I think that language is important as well. So when I first started fundraising or operating in the world of fundraising in East Africa in particular, it was often called resource mobilization. And I thought this was intriguing. But perhaps it's much more comprehensive an approach, because it isn't just focused on finance or funds, but it's looking at the whole cast of characters that might be involved in helping an organization progress or move forward or transform itself. So this concept of resource and mobilization were two very dynamic words for me, and much more reflective of the business that we are in as fundraisers, let's say. I don't know what the noun would be for someone in the business of resource mobilization. Perhaps that's something we could ask the audience to come up with. But my journey, I guess, hinged on me sitting with two hats in Uganda. One hat was really representing the partner institution in the UK, which in this case was the Royal College of Physicians. And at the same time, a group of physicians living and working across East and Southern Africa. And to paint a picture of that region, I predominantly operated across Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. So this is a populous region, I would say, approaching 200 million individuals living in that area. And this population is served by a total of 1,000 registered physicians. So now that ratio there would be roughly equivalent. You probably have 1,000 physicians serving a European city of around 500,000 people. So we're talking about 400 times as many physicians. And we also have to recognize that this part of the world bears a much greater proportion of the disease burden. So not only are there fewer physicians, but there is a greater preponderance of disease and illness that these individuals are having to deal with. And what we found was, by looking into the RCEP's history and reading the original constitution, we could determine that the RCEP was not only to preoccupy itself with the health of people in Britain, which is what one might assume, but health for all. And we were able to utilize that constitutional assertion to represent a case for physicians in the UK to support in a collegiate fashion, their colleagues and the medical community in East and Southern Africa. And the first thing that we did at that point was work with the RCP to devise a survey that would go to its 35,000 members and fellows in order to get a sense of the level of relationship that might exist, because as many of us know, physicians at some point in time will do an elective, and that elective may well have taken place in sub-Saharan Africa. So we found actually that the level of engagement and interaction between the physician community in the UK and in the region that we were looking to establish a new college was much more profound and deep than we had anticipated. And we were able to use that to justify the creation of a fundraising program that was brokered through the Royal College of Physicians, initially to their fellows and members, to raise money to set up a sister college, let's call it, in East and Southern Africa. And we wanted to be sure that we brought on board the wider community. So this wasn't led by the institution, as in the Royal College of Physicians itself, but it was essentially bought into by the physicians who make up that community. And I think it's always important that when we work for an organization, we shouldn't be obsessed about our organizational priorities. We should really obsess about the individuals who our organization serves. And I think it's very important to always acknowledge that act of service that we're all engaged in as an institution, and to really ensure that our mind, the top of our mind is always the population that we serve, rather than our sort of institutional priorities, let's call them. So in the course of that survey, we found that lots of people had spent time in hospitals in East and Southern Africa, where we could essentially establish some sort of twinning arrangement. And in many cases, these twinning arrangements already existed through the health partnership scheme that was run by FET. And by, I guess, inventorizing all of the partnerships and relationships that already existed, both at an institutional and individual level, we were able to paint this incredibly rich and complex tapestry of relationships that already existed and play on that, rather than try and start something from scratch. And I think that was a great lesson for me, as before starting to embark on some sort of fundraising, try and work out what relationships are already there, what framework already exists that you can sort of lean on, and engage those individuals who are already actively involved in sort of partnership deliberations. And then I guess at the same time, we would ensure that the local community was also engaged in fundraising. We did this by setting up a membership scheme for physicians and practicing health practitioners in the region who could make a small annual contribution that would demonstrate local ownership. And we felt this was very important because we were able to use that to leverage support externally. So again, there was a sort of a lesson in there that this was, and I think this is a sort of a partnership principle that I always dwell on, which is it should be a partnership of equals. It shouldn't be a paternalistic relationship that we should establish. But I think I'll stop there. We might return to the notion of partnership principles and perhaps what makes sense in that regard.
And I think that sense of partnership, of connection, of relationships is, I think, pivotal to all the work that we do. And I love that mention of the notion of service, not losing sight of the individual whom we serve, seems to me to be a profoundly important point to all of us. Russell, do you want to comment?
What I find very interesting is just sort of the breadth of the experience and the ability to work across so many different areas. Which is always, I think, a lot more challenging, because it does take us out of our comfort zone, which I think philanthropy often struggles with, actually. Often philanthropy, at least institutionalized philanthropy, sort of my experience is they get almost sort of set in their ways. And relationships develop over sort of long periods of time, which then it's almost as if it's on autopilot. I don't want to be too sort of unfair, and so it's interesting to hear Liam's sort of reflections on what it means when things get disrupted and when you are taken out of your comfort zone. How does philanthropy respond? Although philanthropy is a very, we started out earlier speaking about the connection, the link between development aid and philanthropy. Philanthropy is minuscule in many ways in relation to development aid. Okay, just in terms of the sheer numbers. The size of the philanthropy pot, as it were, and the development aid budget. But at the same time, certain forms of philanthropy are so critical in the lives of so many people, where that philanthropy is being applied. And particularly around civil society organizations that are involved in advocacy. It almost becomes their entire life. And so there's always this interesting tension that we encounter. And so it will be nice to hear some of Liam's sort of reflections, because I'm sure that in the area that he was working in health and physicians, particularly in that part of the world that he's referring to, many of those countries, their health systems would collapse without development aid. I know in places like Tanzania, for example, development aid is critical to health, particularly with children. And I'm sure that other parts as well, although I would imagine places like Kenya, Uganda becoming a lot more self-sufficient, but there would have been certain periods where development aid really was the bedrock of many of those health and education systems as well.
I'm fascinated in that intersection between development aid and philanthropy. I think towards the end, we might come back to that, because I think in this continent, it's a particularly important sort of connection to make. So I think I'm going to move on to my set of little stories, because I've got two connecting stories, very different perspectives, because mine was London-based, traveling the world, looking into Africa, as opposed to where you two were, in country, working for African institutions. My first is to do with an organisation that I believe you're the chair of, which is Inyatelo in South Africa. Chair of the board. A marvellous, remarkable institution that is engaged with developing community, particularly around philanthropy, but in all ways of building that sort of social capital. I was invited to a breakfast debate on International Women's Day in Cape Town. There were 4 women of colour academics. One was 25, doing her PhD. She was at UCT. She was with you, Russell. And an older woman in her late 70s who had experienced the apartheid years, who'd been incarcerated as an academic. And it was the most extraordinary, moving experience of my life. And I sat with a woman next to me who I'd never met. And we were both crying because their stories were so powerful, particularly the older woman, who was not bitter. She just kept saying, I believe in hope. I believe the world will get better. I have always believed the world will get better, and I've had these horrible experiences, but I have never lost sight of the importance of hope in our lives. And I was talking to this woman next to me, and we'd never met previously, but when the event ended and we were reflecting on what we had just experienced with these 4 very different perspectives of these women, I was commenting on this beautiful African fabric shawl that she was wearing, because I said, you know, I love the vibrancy of the African fabrics, but as a woman of Irish culture and heritage, I don't think I can get away with wearing it, but your scarf is beautiful. And she said, funnily enough, she said, in my bag, I have one that's exactly the same, because I had them both made yesterday. And the universe has told me that I have to give this scarf to you. So I said, that's marvelous. And when I came home, I had it made into cushions. Exhibit A of my beautiful cushions, because I thought I want them in my life every day, not a shawl I put on once in a while. That event, I think, as somebody who parachuted into many cultures around the world, was vivid in that it taught me a lot about the richness of the South African community, the warmth, the friendliness, the challenging history, but the resilience of people who wanted to tell their story, who wanted their story to be nuanced, that it wasn't something that when you look at it from a perspective of not living in the continent and only arriving in the continent maybe once or twice a year. I learned a great deal about the importance of cultural intelligence, that you have to be in the country, you have to listen, you have to understand the stories, you have to understand the nuance of those stories for you to be able to put together a convincing and compelling and honest story about why organizations in the transformation piece that they're seeking, why they need support from Europe or from all over the world. So that was, I think it was probably my most memorable. I came out of that meeting and got straight on a plane and came home to London, and I wore that shawl on the flight thinking, wow, what an extraordinary country. And I love your country, Russell. It's not without challenge, but it is one of the most extraordinary places that I love to return to. So that was my first piece. The second piece was a case conference that we ran the following year in Nairobi. And based on what we'd experienced in South Africa, there was a lot of our African community from all over, but particularly in Kenya, because that's where most of the delegates came from that year. They were saying, we learned a lot from the American, the British, the Australian experts that you bring into our country as part of these conferences. But actually what we want is we want African faces, African voices, African experiences. Because when people come and they run a fundraising team that has 200 people, they don't begin to chime with the experience that we have in our institutions. So we want to understand, how do people do it here? You know, what is the experience of someone in my country or the neighboring country in the way that they are developing their philanthropy? And the piece that we did in Nairobi is every single speaker was African born, except me. I mean, I was just facilitating. And I think there was a power, because there was something of the nuance of the understanding of how it was to be trying to do these things from within the countries and the institutions that our delegates were working from. And I think that became a talisman, not just for the work that I was doing in Africa, but actually all over the world, which is the importance of cultural intelligence, the importance of the understanding of the nuance of the story. So both, you two both spoke powerfully about a story that you understood because you were inside the institution, and I was not. I would arrive in different cultures. And you need, my learning was that you need to listen really hard. You need to talk to people, and you need not to tell people how to do things. You need to listen to their challenge and share experience, that this might work for you, this might work for you, but it may not. And it's about, how do we build that community within the African fundraisers? The experience there, particularly in Kenya, and particularly in Nairobi actually, was that the vice chancellors, the heads of those institutions, were very interested in the role that philanthropy could play in their institutions. And I think that sense of it's a contested space that you described, Ali, was absolutely true in the Kenyan universities too. But I think that for me, as somebody who didn't live and work in Africa, learning that piece of how to arrive in a new culture, not to assume, I mean, I don't think there is an African perspective. I don't think there's a Kenyan perspective in the way that there's not a UK perspective. And so looking for the nuance of the story and the understanding of how you tell that in a compelling way. So that's my contribution as someone who hasn't lived and worked as you two have in the continent, but someone who has loved the visit and finds the stories very compelling. I was very taken. We had a number of senior business people who spoke at that conference in Nairobi, and the passion was, we don't want to be third world economies. This is all about how do we create first world economies. This isn't asking for pity or charity. This is about rebuilding our nations for the future. Powerful, powerful stuff. So I'll end there. Do either of you want to comment on that perspective?
You know, it just sort of two brief observations that I want to make, which I think, at least for me, captures a lot of what you said. One is one of the, I think Liam used a sort of saying earlier about part of look where you slip as a framing metaphor in many ways. One of the and so we using sayings. One of my favorite in relation to philanthropy. I'm not sure of the source. I think it may actually be Khalil Gibran. Surprise, surprise. You know, I'm going to sort of paraphrase. It's not necessarily word for word. It's just what he sort of says is that true philanthropy is not about what you think people need. True philanthropy is what you realize you need. And so it's about those connections. It's about those partnerships. It's about wanting to make a difference in the world. And I think that just flips things around, that it's so it doesn't go, and I think Liam also mentioned about that, of seeing that there were already rich connections and experiences, and that it's about using what's actually there as opposed to wanting to come and thinking that you're doing things de novo. So when you kind of approach philanthropy in that way, you're then more open to seeing what is already there, as opposed to what you see is lacking. You know, so it's that old deficit, approach, as opposed to actually seeing that people, regardless of the philanthropy, get on with their lives. You know, difficult as you know as it is. And the other is what I think is a way that I reconcile with myself, and maybe this is me rationalizing to myself why I'm comfortable, even although I question all the time, working in this world of sort of philanthropy, because we all know the debates about the power dynamics and accumulated wealth and the power, the disparities, is that if private wealth, which is what philanthropy most often is the case, can do some public good, then there is a justification for trying to help to make that shift. If that's what the philanthropy is going to do, and that again then quickly goes into this whole debate about development aid, because development aid is already public money. And yet it is often used for partisan, political, or other kinds of purposes. And so if philanthropy can also push that message, that if wealth, whether public or private, can be used for public good, that then I think is a sort of message that's worth taking notice of.
Thank you, Russell. Liam, do you want to comment? And I think also pick up that piece about the connection between philanthropy and development aid, because I'm worried that if we keep moving, we won't come back to it. And it seems to me to be a really important part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just riff off something that Russell said. And that's, I think, this sense that philanthropy is really focused on not organizations that have needs, but organizations that serve needs. And again, that goes back to this point about organizations are simply a sort of a vehicle for delivering service to a group of people. So again, what I guess what binds us all together is that we're all fundamentally human beings. And so we should focus on stories about human lives and human beings, and we can all learn from that. So I think the more successful organizations, particularly at the moment, are those that are very adept at representing the people they serve and giving them a voice and ensuring that their voice is amplified and appropriately represented, whether that's on a stage, whether that's in a sort of in print, whether that's in broadcast. So there is something about the sort of the storytelling piece And I'm going to use another African phrase here, because this is probably my favorite one. And I think it speaks to this point about Russell's observations around roads and various others. And that's this one around the lion. I've got to find it, actually.
Yeah, that history, the history is told by the lions rather than by the hunters. It would be a different
Exactly. Here we go. I've got it. Until the lion side of the story is heard, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
In fact, I actually wrote
Beautiful.
On the Roads Must Fall movement, which starts with that quote.
Oh, well, I'm glad I saw that, and I just thought I'd reflected on what you'd said earlier, and I thought that's a wonderfully poetic way of expressing this. Tricia, your question around development aid. When I went to live in Zanzibar for a year, what I was struck by were the statistics around the government investment in the health budget. So at the time, that was $6 million. So this would have been 10 years ago. Not sure what it is now. That's $6 million for a population of 1 million people. So $6 per person is the health expenditure per individual on these islands. The WHO minimum requirement per person is $33. So there's a huge gulf between the minimum requirement as expressed by WHO standards and what was provided for through the official government budget. So in a case like that, development assistance was absolutely fundamental to the provision of health for the people of that island. But those were generally set on quite tight terms. Bilateral aid, as many of us have recognized, are quite seriously governed. They're quite rigid. And so there's a wonderful space there for smaller organizations to come in very nimble in their behaviors, spot a problem, and move into that space. So, for example, when we were there, we saw that this hospital had fallen into disrepair, and a very small British charity run by a team almost entirely made up of doctors was able to go in and to revive the medical service there and to support the training and development of the staff who were on the ground, but also to rebuild the hospital through a sort of a moderate level of capital investments. So I think there's a place for both development aid and the smaller charity sector in this activity. And that charity is still there running this hospital 10 years later. So I guess the one question I would have is, what's the exit strategy? Over what period of time would it be important for a charity to sort of remove itself from the equation in an instance such as this, so that sort of dependency disseminates over time?
Indeed, thank you. And I was going to, my favorite African quote was when I was on a plane, and I don't know who said it actually, but I know who told it to me. I was on a plane flying into my very first experience in Africa, and the guy sat next to me on the plane said, "Have you ever been to Africa before?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Once you get African dust on your clothing, it's very hard to shake it off." And I love that, because it's that sense that, it's challenging, it's complex, it's infuriating sometimes, but it's completely compelling, and you can't stop once you start. So I share your passion for the piece. Now, we have been asked by IFAB to reflect a little on the impact of COVID in this space, because I think whatever it is we thought we were doing a year ago, it's not what we're doing now. At least it's not how we're doing it now. So it would be helpful for the pair of you to reflect on the COVID perspective. Russell, how is it for you in South Africa?
It's surreal. It's really surreal. Our government is recognized as having responded fairly well, taken the pandemic very seriously. Some people think that initially the government may have overreacted. Mainly because one of the concerns, obviously, with the virus is how harmful it is when you're dealing with comorbidities or underlying conditions. And as you know, although we have managed now the AIDS epidemic through the antiretroviral therapies that are available, there's still obviously concerns at the rates of infection, TB, of course, is widespread, and then the other non-communicable diseases that we know, like sugar diabetes and obesity, hypertension, which is all common in our part of the world because many of these diseases are linked to poverty. And so when those initial stories of or explanations of how devastating the impact of this virus could be on people with underlying conditions, our government decided that it should err on the side of caution. And so we had a very, very hard lockdown for initially for about a month, and it was extended for a couple of weeks. And it did definitely slow the rate of infection. But we are now experiencing waves or spikes, and infection rates are going up, and of course, the higher the rates of infection, the more sort of fatalities. And so there's a sort of strange atmosphere, almost sort of in the country. On one hand, did we overreact, and because that hard lockdown had serious impact on the economy, and of course in certain parts of the country, like in Cape Town, the tourism industry has collapsed, and it depends on tourism, so the economic impact is very, very harsh. At the same time, there's this feeling that, have we not yet seen the worst of this? Are we, are we going to see our hospitals really being overcrowded? And so we kind of in this sort of a space of still uncertainty, finding our way through it. But it has been profoundly destabilizing. It has upended us in many ways, and we're still trying to make sense of it, to be quite honest.
I think you're not alone. I think you're not alone. Liam, how has it affected the world that you operate in?
Yeah, well, I won't sort of perhaps reference the health consequences, because we're all, I guess, in tune with that in our different communities. But in terms of fundraising, I think there are certainly opportunities for us all to harness technology and to embrace the opportunities that presents us with for fundraising activity. And I would say this operates in various spheres. So major donors, for example, are not traveling. They are not going into the office. They're not sitting in endless internal meetings, which means they have never been more available. And what I'm seeing is some organizations are doing brilliantly with their major gift fundraising, because they're seeing the opportunity there because of the availability of those individuals who are already donors. So it's wonderful for stewardship, but also in capturing new donors through digital. So I think there's certainly something that we can learn there about availability. The second piece is certainly for the fundraising that I've been doing on behalf of African organizations. There's a great way to transport your support community, whether that's a partner or whether that's a donor, into your space, into your geography, into your environment. And you can do this very effectively online. So, for example, I've been helping create a new junior school in Uganda. It's in a very rich biodiverse environment. And ordinarily, the site meetings, which take place with the architects and the construction teams every month, we've been able to open that out to all the donors. So rather than have a site meeting just with your M&E people, your QS, your construction managers, and your architect design team, and so on, you actually have all of the donors sitting at the table, and we start it with a 30-minute site visit. So the architect walks us around with a handheld camera live around the site and is able to take us into the classrooms, into the school farm, into the woods, into the conservation area, and walk us through that environment, which gives an amazing opportunity to the donors to feel part of both the decision-making around design and construction principles, but to really get a sense of place. And that's, after all, that's the most effective fundraising takes place when we can bring people, invite people into our world, let's say.
Now, I'm mindful, team, that we've got about 6 minutes until we've got the end of our hour together. And I think our closing piece is an opportunity for each of us to reflect on what advice would we give people who are engaged in this philanthropic connection between Africa and Europe? So as your closing piece, Russell, what would you like to say to people who've joined us on IFAB today?
So we're definitely going into a different world. We don't know what that world is going to look like, but we know that it's going to be different. One of the things that we do know about this new world is that issues of connectivity, of the digital space, of the virtual online world is going to be key, is critical. And so one of the things that I would encourage a lot of funders to look at is that this period is an opportunity to try and close the inequality gaps, particularly in this new world that we going to emerge out of. And the worst thing that we can do is that this crisis exacerbates or deepens the inequalities by donors either disengaging or focusing on what is happening at home, prioritizing that at the cost of what's happening elsewhere. Because if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's the inextricable global bonds that exist, and these can be bonds of either solidarity or of exclusion. And so donors have a critical role in ensuring that the bonds of solidarity are strengthened.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo Russell's point that many of us are living in environments where it would be normal to look at perhaps inwards and to perhaps become domestically focused. And, various reports coming out that the UK charity sector is probably £10 billion short of what it was the previous year due to COVID. But I don't think we want to get waylaid by that. We have to remain globally engaged. And I think for organizations that are in the business of raising money internationally, we all have to be preoccupied with communication, and we have to use digital to serve our programs. And what I would say is perhaps two points, very, very practical points on this. One is make sure your website is brilliant. Make sure it speaks brilliantly to the audiences that you're hoping to connect into your work and tells the human stories that we've referenced a number of times during the course of the day, because that's the window into our world that we will be projecting more and more. And secondly, transactions. If you're inviting transactions, make sure they're functional. I go into so many websites where I'm invited to make a gift and it's impossible to make a gift for some reason. So we need to ensure that if we're asking for money, we make it as easy as possible for somebody to fulfill that commitment. So those would be my sort of two takeaways.
Your parting shots. Thank you, Liam. I reflect on the hour that we've spent together, and it strikes me that our business, our world, is not for the faint-hearted. It's a world of courageous professional activity right now. That sense of Russell, you talked about the contested space that we worked in, but also the opportunities for transformation, and that sense of contradictions, particularly I think in Africa, that we've all experienced. I love Liam. I love your look where you slip. I think that's going to stay with me. I think that's a powerful piece. And I love that sense of it's not about organizations that have needs, it's organizations that serve needs. But I want to finish on a reflection about the point you both made about global bonds. Because it strikes me with all the calls that I've been involved in, that the more we are stuck behind boundaries and borders, we're all home-based now. Those of us who used to travel a lot, we don't travel anymore. And I notice that across the world, people want to connect with each other. And the only way we can do that is digitally. And so we have gathered communities of people who would never have traveled to speak to each other, but when they can connect, they are hungry for it. So that opportunity to connect with your peer group all over the world, what are you doing? How are you doing it? How does it work? What have you learned? I'm chairing a call just tomorrow morning where we have African colleagues, we have people from Hong Kong, China, Singapore, Australia coming together because it works in the time zone. And I think more of that global bond, more of that global connection that these are problems that are not about looking in, but they are about looking up and looking out. So I think it just serves me to say thank you very much to Russell, and thank you very much to Liam. I think it's been an extraordinary experience. So thank you very much for joining us.